chapter 20, verse 7 through 10, if somebody will read that. That'd be awesome.
And when the 1,000 years ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sands of the sea, and they march up over the broad plain of the earth and surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophets were. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
All right, so begins with Satan being released. Somebody turned off all my electronics. There we go. Okay. Starts off with Satan being released. Notice that the abyss has changed in this verse to being considered a prison. So he's not released from the abyss, he's released from his prison. So it's just an interesting little thing that happens there. Then in verse 8, he moves on and he goes to say that Satan goes on the offensive. He was incapable of deceiving the nations while in his chains. Now he goes and he does just that, deceives the nations. Then we have this phrase, the four corners of the world. What does four corners of the world mean? Yeah, all of the world. It's just a euphemism for all of the world. Basically, this is common throughout most ancient cultures. But you have your compass points, right? And so you have your four corners of the earth and that mindset. So that seems to be what is happening here. What John sees is a fulfillment of Ezekiel 38 through 39. Especially chapters 19 and 20 are fulfillments of both of those throughout it. The primary opponents in Ezekiel 38 through 39 is a group called Gog and Magog. John equates Satan's activities with this Gog and Magog activities. He says that they will gather for the battle. This is something that is interesting in Revelation, especially in chapter 16 and 19, and here in 20. The only time that we have, it's polemic, it's polemos. The only time you have that word for battle or war, we see it throughout Revelation, but the only time that you have the battle and the war appears 3 times in Revelation, and it's always in association with this final battle concept. So in 16, 14 through 16 we have it, and in 19, 17 through 21, and then also here. So the battle is the concept here. We also see a fulfillment of Zechariah 12 through 14 and Zephaniah 3. Those have been used throughout Revelation, and it comes again here. The people that are coming to battle are called as numerous as the sands on the seashore. What does that mean? A gob of them. Okay. It definitely relates to a great number, but in particular, it talks to the idea of being outnumbered. We actually see this phrase used quite a bit in the Old Testament. So Joshua 11:4, the Israelites go out to fight against Jabin, the king of Hazor, Joab, the king of Madon, and all of the northern kings of Canaan. And when the Canaanite army appears, they are described as being as numerous as the sands on the seashore. And who wins? Yeah, Israel, right? Joshua wins, right? In Judges 7:8, Gideon is told to whittle down his army to 800 men. They come up on the Midianite camp, and we're told that the army is as thick as locusts and that their camels are as uncountable as the sands of the seashore. And who wins? Gideon. In 1 Samuel 13:5, Saul's first battle as the newly appointed king of Israel, the Philistines come forth in such numbers that their soldiers are described as being as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And who wins? Saul. So what we have in mind here is probably not a literal number, but rather just an idea of an uncountable number that outnumbers God's people. And I think we see that historically to be accurate more often than not. Yes, yeah, Abraham does get a promise that his descendants will be as numerous as the sands on the seashore, which is interesting because usually that phrase is negative and not positive, unlike here. So again, what I would say here is this does not necessitate a raising of all wicked people, saying that there's not 3 resurrections as dispensationalists would say, but rather probably just whoever's on earth at this time when Satan was released is probably the ones that are there. I think that's what we can argue, even though it has that phrasing is used not to say that that's a literal number, just to say it's a vast, big people that are outnumbering God's people. All right, then in verse 9, the armies of the nations march across the breadth of the earth to come against God's people. This reflects Habakkuk 1:6, which discusses the armies of Babylon coming against Israel. It says that they swept across the whole earth to take what did not belong to them. And here Gog and Magog surround God's people in the city that he loves. The camp of God's people is how the NIV says it. They surround the camp of God's people. The word there is hagios, which is holy ones or saints. NIV likes to translate it people instead of saints every once in a while for some reason. What's interesting is this is, again, an Old Testament concept. It's the stated name of the Israelites in the wilderness, right? They are the camp of God's people in the Old Testament. And so kind of is interesting concept there. And then agios, and that should have an H. And it's not agios, it's hagios. Holy ones or saints is that word there. Then what does he say? It's the camp of God's people, and then the city that he loves. Okay, and that's going to be interesting because the camp of God's people are probably just talking about Christians, all right, the collective Christians. And then he uses this city that he loves, which again is going to be collective for Christians, and it's going to be important when we get to Revelation 21 and 22 when we see the city come out of heaven and be on earth, right? We're going to have this understanding of the city representing symbolically God's people, okay? And that the description of the city in 21 and 22 are going to be in mind. So just plant that in the back of your mind. I know it's probably going to be next week before we really get to it, so I'll ask you about it next week. So just kind of be like, oh yeah, I need to remember that. Jot it down or something. Okay, all right. Lastly, like Ezekiel 39, fire consumes God's enemies before a battle actually takes place. This is probably also reflecting upon 2 Kings 1. I don't know if that was any better. Okay. 2 Kings 1, the king Ahaziah of Israel had fallen and injured himself, and he sent messengers to ask Baal if he would recover. And Elijah met the messengers, and he rebuked Ahaziah for seeking Baal rather than Yahweh. And when Ahaziah heard the rebuke, he sent soldiers to capture Elijah, and fire came down from heaven and consumed the messengers. So kind of fits the same thing, right? Fits the witness of Revelation, also in Revelation chapter 10. The witnesses have fire that consume. So just a reflection on those things. Then verse 10, we finally get to the judgment of the dragon, all right? And so we are told here that the devil, he is the deceiver, and this has always been his tactic, right? Adam and Eve, he talked to Eve, and what did he do to Eve? He deceived her, right? It's a deception. God didn't really say that. That's not what's really going to happen. It's a deceptive tactic, and it's always been his tactic, okay? What is the fate of the devil, according to verse 10? Yeah, lake of fire, right? Burning fire or sulfur or whatever. Yeah, lake of fire. Again, probably not a literal lake, but figurative for judgment, and definitely a place outside of the new creation, as we'll see in a little bit. There is no verb here where with the phrase "where the beast and false prophets." So that leads us to a wonderful language problem. Okay, so in English you have to have verbs with pretty much every clause. Anytime you have a clause, you have to have a verb. In Greek, that's not necessarily the case, which is awesome when you're trying to translate it back to make it make sense in English. So you usually have to supply verbs, and when you do that, you also have to supply tenses. All right? So what we get here is this question: what tense do we use? We pretty much are confident that the verb should be are tossed. What you have to decide is it past tense, present tense, future tense? Or they don't have future, they have aorist. Which tense do you want to use? And that is usually determined by your millennial bent. So however you feel about the millennium usually determines the tense that you use. I just want to throw that out there. You can choose whatever tense you want because it's not there, and you get to decide. Yay! So if anyone says, well, this verse says, well, that's not true because this verb's not there. And so you got to kind of do things. What we should get is this: the unholy holy trinity, right? You had the dragon, the beast of the land, the beast of the sea. The unholy trinity are going to spend eternity in that lake. All right, and we get that from a couple of phrases there. Night and day talks about being unceasing, forever and ever, so eternal. So there is no hint of annihilation. Okay, so those who are nihilists, that someday they'll just cease to exist, that is not a biblical concept, at least not in Revelation, and that they are tormented. This word for torment is probably in spirit and mind, and again, likely stemming from their separation from the God of creation. So what do we learn?
Satan's going to be released. He's going to form an army. And he's going to lose and be cast into heaven.
Yeah. Short and sweet, right?
And you're going to live forever, either in hell or in heaven.
Okay, yes. There is no annihilation.
I
Yeah.
never really thought about that,
Is there any
You
such-
choose the right option, you get to walk on streets of gold.
Again, we got to talk about that next week. But
Is there any separation between what human beings are going to see as their hell compared to what Satan sees as his? I would think that he would have it a little worse when he was in the presence of God.
it's all going to be. This is going to be 100% speculation because there's nothing that's said. Revelation is going to say they're going to be cast into a lake of fire where the dragon is. So I mean, I don't know. Essentially, where I get to is I don't know the answer to that. So, Revelation 21 seems to say that there's this new heaven and new earth. We're going to jump a little bit ahead here. So the new creation, and that the lake is outside of that. So if you have this as the new creation, the lake is something outside of it. Which is why I would tend to say that it's a complete separation from the God of the universe. But since the God of the universe is the one that sustains all things and holds all things together, as Colossians tells us, that creates some kind of torment for them to be, because we're not, even if we reject God and reject Jesus, we're still connected to him in some way because Jesus, is by his very being, is holding us all together. And so that separation outside of creation, it creates a torment, and whatever that is. I don't want to experience it. It's essentially where I kind of fall onto, I don't know what it is, but I don't want to experience it.
Consider this concept. God is love. God is a consuming fire. And God is present everywhere. So the love of God is like a consuming fire to those that have not been protected by the love of Christ. So So we know that God is going to be in hell because his presence is everywhere. But even David said that I can't even go to hell without getting anything to get away from me. So if you don't receive the protection that comes from the anointing when you get saved, and you die in that condition, the love of God is a consuming fire to you. Even in, so the separation that you got shown there, even that place, the love of God will be present, but it's like a lake of fire to you because you're not protected by the.
So I don't know. I understand what you're trying to say. I think you got to kind of be careful not to fall into what's called pantheism, where God is in everything, because that's not a biblical concept. God is present, but it doesn't mean that he's in everything.
But his presence would be like a consuming fire to you.
Possibly. I mean, in 21, which we're not going to be able to probably get to all the way today, I mean, it says that God is with his people, physically present in the new creation, but that those who are outside of that in some way. And we might get to that verse, but we won't be able to dive deeply into the fact that God's present with his people until next week. So I just would be cautious on explaining it in that manner. Not that you're wrong and what I think you're trying to say. It's just you kind of start getting into God's not, the Spirit's inside me, but he's not. If I wasn't a Christian, the Spirit's not inside me, and God's not necessarily inside me in that way either. Other than I have the image of God, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm making it more muddied or not. So I do have here the God will judge the dragon whose fate is sealed for eternity. And so, like you said, you get his choice in where you're going to spend eternity, either in the presence of God or outside of it. So, all right, let's look at the next one. Sometimes called the Great White Throne Judgments. I just have here the judgment of humanity, and it's found in verses 11 through 15, the rest of this chapter, if someone wants to read it.
Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. Earth and sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire.
All right, so we started with the unholy trinity being judged. Now we're going to dive into the fate of humanity, in particular the righteous and the wicked. What do we do with their followers is essentially what the rest of this chapter deals with. First, we're told that a throne of God appears, a great white throne, and him who is seated on it. Okay, we're going to assume that this is probably God. We've not seen God's throne since chapter 5, when the scroll with the seals was given out. The throne first appeared before the pre-consummate judgments of chapters 6 through 20. Now appears at the final judgment of humanity. That's kind of what we can glean from this. We probably are at the end of time. Why? I'll give you the answers. Yeah, because there's cosmological changes. All right, so heaven and earth, they flee away because there is no place for them to be found. The sea is gone as well. We don't get to that yet, but things are different. So that happens at the end of time. This is very similar to what we see in 6:14 and in 16:20, which probably hints that those two passages are also talking about the very end of time, the consummation of the world. Then in chapter 12, where it's said that the dead, great and small, stand before the throne. Let's see here. The phrase great and small is used of believers in 11:18 and of the wicked in 19:18. And so what we probably have here is both, right? Everybody's coming and standing before God, all people. I have here that this is probably the great resurrection of all people for judgment. Everyone will come back to life. Sometimes we get this idea that only Christians get to come back to life. All people are going to come back to life, some for eternal life, some for a second death, right? And we just need to keep that in mind. We will all rise, but some with the good thing in mind and some not so much. This idea is found in Daniel chapter 12:2, John 5:28, Acts 24:15. It is often called the second resurrection. Does it say that here? No, it's not said second. Sometimes it's called second resurrection, which is interesting. 2 books are open. What are the 2 books? One is the Book of Life. What's the first one? Probably. We actually see this in Daniel 7 and in Daniel 12, this idea of 2 books and being judged by them. It says the dead are judged by these books. And so probably the first one is deeds, an account of what you've done, probably morally more than anything else, ethically. And then the second one is the Book of Life, which is the important one in the end, right? As we see in this chapter. Verse 13 through 14 says, the sea gave up its dead that were in it, that death and Hades gave up its dead, and each person was judged according to what they were done. The sea and death and Hades give up their dead. These are probably the same idea, the sea being a place of the residence of the dead, and death and Hades being the residence of the dead, just 2 different ways of saying the same thing. We'll see sea taking an important role in the next section as well. So if they are 2 places, then one might be for the righteous and the other one for the wicked, although that kind of gets convoluted at times. Like, what does that mean, and how do we dive into it? We do see a sea of glass in which Christians stand next to, but the sea of glass is always in the presence of God and probably talking about God's control over creation, right? Like, how many times do you just look at a lake or a sea and it's just smooth? It's not often, right? Like, usually there's some kind of wind whipping waves. All right, so to have the sea be completely smooth so that it's like glass in the presence of God is that God has control over everything. And so I say these probably the same idea. It makes the most sense. Interesting, the sea is called a realm of wicked in 13:1 and 15:2, and so maybe it is the wicked, and death and Hades is something else. Again, in the end it doesn't matter. The dead are judged based on their deeds. That's what matters in the end. We can go into rabbit holes if we wanted to.
In the first verse, in that it sounds like the heavens were a realm of the wicked as well. So the earth and the heavens.
That's creation. When we have the word heavens, we have to decide what are we talking about. So and this really comes from Hebrews, or the Hebrew language. It's always heavens. There's always plural. It's never singular. And so sometimes we're talking about the abode that God lives in, and sometimes we're talking about sky and outer space and that type of stuff. In this case, it's probably like the created universe. Earth and the created universe flees away from God's presence.
I thought it'd be like the realm of the entities and powers, that Paul talks about.
Again, when we have heavens, we always have to decide, are we talking about the spiritual or the physical? And context matters in that case. And I would say, since we're talking about earth and heavens, we're probably talking about the physical side, especially since they're fleeing away and there's no place found for them.
I think it's more of a contrast. Earth is your physical, and the heavens is what you can't see that is all around you.
But
Because, and that would line up like with Hebrew thought too. I mean, they thought of all the wicked, demonic stuff that was going on in the heavens above and around them.
Sometime. Again, this is it all depends on.
But it's judgment over stuff, and I think it would probably be over a spiritual realm, wouldn't it? Because it says it's fleeing from him. I don't know. It doesn't matter, but I mean that's what it seems like.
Yeah, no, I think because earth and heavens are together, we're talking about the physical creation. It's typically, this is typically always physical in this verse. I don't know that I know a commentator that says it's the spiritual. I'd have to look it up. You're going to go look it up. On this particular verse, no, I believe that there's a heavens that's a spiritual realm. It's just in each verse, you have to take what's happening right there. So, like, if I don't know if there's a verse that says it, but they say, "Hey, there was a sign in the heavens," right? They might be actually talking about a comet serving as a sign, all right. And it's not that we're talking about the spiritual heavens. We're talking about the physical heavens that we can see, the stars in the heavens and stuff. And so you just have to decide in each time that pops up what to do.
This is a picture of judgment, so what?
Right, but it's also a picture of the end of all things. Right? So consummation comes before judgment. And so he says, I see a great white throne, and the consummation, the cosmological changes occur. The way the world was is now changing to something new that we're going to see in the next verse, really. And so the old way of things is being done, right? Like, so go to 21 verse 1. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth have passed away. And that can be spiritual, but it can also be the physical things. The old order is gone. Now we have a new. Okay. We can move on. Yeah. All right. The next thing it says is death and Hades are tossed into the lake of fire. This is probably to note that one of two things, either that death is ended or the place of the death has been transferred to the lake of fire. So if you die, you're going to be in the lake of fire. Both concepts are there and present, but for sure death is ended is part of there too. And then it says the lake of fire is the second death. So these places, this realm that has haunted humanity, right, is now done away with at the end of all things. All right. Lastly, verse 15, it says, anyone whose name is not found in the book of life is placed in the lake of fire as well. We do have to ask the question, what is the book of life?
God's chosen people.
Where do you guys get this? Let's do that.
Basically, those who are going to heaven.
Okay, why do you say that?
It was mentioned earlier in the script, wasn't it?
Oh, good job. So the fuller name is the book of the life, a book of life of the Lamb who was slain, and that's used in 13:8. It's also mentioned briefly in 21:27. But is the book special?
Your name's not there, you're
Going in the lake of fire.
Yeah, if you're not in there, yeah. So what I have here is the book itself is not special, but the person who possesses it, right? The lamb that possesses it makes it special because it's his. And I have here, probably might suggest a long memory for God because your name is written down, long memory. And just to kind of, not that God needs to write it down to remember it, but just to communicate the idea of long memory. But it also is in this book found those who belong to the city, who is the bride of Christ. And so that's what we're going to see, I think, in that 21.
Is your name written down when you die or before?
I'd say before, because in the letters it says, to the one who's victorious, I will not erase his name from the book, right? So the name has to be in there for it to be erased, whatever that means. yeah, you shouldn't do that anyways because there's no. I don't know when I'm going to die, so do not suggest doing that, right? Because if you're waiting till the last minute,
There were people on their deathbed being baptized.
right, and that's honestly that's between them and God. That's always I'd try in general not to say you're going to hell and you're going to heaven, because I don't get to say in that, right? I'm not God. I don't get to write any names in the book. At the same time, like you really should be faithful when you believe.
So do you think your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life before you're even born, and then it's blotted out when it's determined that you are not?
Oh gosh.
'Cause I would think that children go to heaven. I mean, even like the stillborn or the aborted, their name would be written in the Lamb's Book of Life.
I'm going to say that that's not stated one way or the other in the Bible, and I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to touch that. 20-foot pole there.
But you wait, those young ones until they reach a cage of accountability, whatever that is, are gonna go to heaven. To me, when your name is written in the book of life is when you accept Christ. Your name is written there. If you die before the age of accountability, you don't have to accept Christ because you died before you understand what's going on.
Then would your name be written there already?
So that go out and home.
I would think if you died.
Well, in chapter last week,
It's blotted out.
I didn't think it was going to be this bad, so. Yeah, that's I brought that up. So, Book of Life is really only mentioned in Revelation, which is why it's an interesting concept to dive into. Doesn't I think I have it on there? Oh, nope, I don't. So yeah, in one of the letters to the churches, so chapter 2 or chapter 3, I'm not sure which one. It does mention. I didn't put it on there, but then it's mentioned 3 more times, so 4 times total. But yeah, and it talks about to the one who's victorious, I will not blot his name is essentially what it says. So
The first step of this, though, was that you get judged by your deeds, right?
Yes.
So I guess we're assuming people that have deeds, for one, to be
Yeah.
judged, which I think it's interesting to remember. We all get judged by our deeds.
Yeah.
We all are going to hell. I mean, because the second step is, are you in the book of life? 'Cause
Right.
None of us are passing phase 1.
right, yeah, and I think that's a good point to point out because he does. That's what it essentially says is everyone's judged by their deeds, and only those whose names in the book of life are saved. And it's a good concept to remember that we don't do anything for our own salvation. God has done it all. The question is, are we in Christ? And that's the most important decision we have to make. Yeah, that's what generally. The general, I think, consensus among Christians is when you become a Christian, your name is in the book. Again,
And then they can be blotted out if you don't live.
Whereas
It seems to
that
be
actually
suggested.
makes sense with the question they asked about babies, that even as babies would have their name in the book of deeds, until they come to that point of understanding right from wrong and need for a savior, they have no bad deeds, right? You haven't done anything wrong, so they would actually be justified by deeds in that moment, which would say that they wouldn't have to be in the book of life, they would be in the book of deeds, because they're not accountable for what they've done. They don't understand sin.
again, it's a 20. It's an interesting concept. So
I think I hear what you're saying, but we try to make God logical.
Yeah. Well, I'm just.
And that.
Well, if he's just,
yeah,
that's not. I think he is logical because he's just, and just.
but I think what you're trying to say is our human logic doesn't always line up with what God is actually doing. Yeah, I don't get to make that decision, and it's okay. All right. What can we learn? All right.
People apparently love to challenge,
Oh,
Accept the Lord and don't worry about it.
yeah. I have here, all will be judged based on their deeds in this life, but ultimately salvation is found in the Lamb who was slain. And I think that's the most important part. So I would love to dive into the next section, but it's a little bit longer, so I'm going to have to stop there. So what kind of happened, I can do a summary here. So what kind of happens is we get a kind of an end to something that really started in chapter 17, I think. So 17:1 through chapters 21:8, we have almost a chiastic structure. So in 17, you have the great city, right? And the great city is equal to who? Nope, not in Revelation. Babylon in Revelation, right? Anytime you see great city in Revelation, it's always Babylon. And then here at 21, 1 through 8, we get the holy city, and the holy city is Jerusalem. Yes, yeah. Here. Just to make sure it's clear, Rome is what John's talking about there. So, and so like we have these different things that are happening throughout it, but what ends up happening is the holy city being described coming and coming together on earth, so we have this kind of conclusion, and then 21:9 through 22. I want to say 6. Don't hold me to that, but 6 I think is a description. What's that?
Don't quote you on that.
Yeah, don't quote me. It might be a little bit. It might be 5. I don't remember. Description of the city. So we're having this. So this kind of is a new section describing the city. And what you find in the description is essentially all of the promises that we find in the letters. So chapters 2 to 3 are retold here as the perfect church. Here's what the bride of Christ looks like. Here's the promises that are being fulfilled in the consummation when God dwells with his people for eternity. So this kind of will wrap up this section here that starts in chapter 17. Again, it's great that they put chapters and verses, but those are not gospel. They were added later, and so it makes it kind of hard sometimes to divide things depending on.
Okay, Tony, so we're all going to be judged.
Yep.
Okay, I accepted Christ. I'm holy because Christ is holy.
Yep.
Why am I judged if I'm holy whenever that time comes? I'm already holy. I've already been accepted by Christ. I'm already saved. Why do I go through an experience? Well, it's like a tribulation, that's coming and all that stuff. Why, if I am holy, do I have to endure that?
So again, this is not explicitly said, but I would think it'd be to kind of just give us greater appreciation to what God has done for us, to recognize that it wasn't me who did any of this. Paul does mention, I think in 1 Corinthians, about how our deeds are judged and refined with fire, and what remains is the good stuff, and the chaff is blown away. And so, I mean, it's a very New Testament concept, not just a Revelation concept, that Christians are judged for their actions. I'd say even the parable of the talents is kind of in that same vein, right? God gives you a talent. He gives you something to use, to be stewards of. And those that do well with it, he says, well done, good and faithful servants. And those who don't, he says,
In a perfect world, Jesus is going to step in and say, he's one of mine. He didn't have to be judged.
right, but we still have to stand before. I mean, it's very clear that we still stand before, and then that ultimately Jesus steps in. And
There's multiple times it was promised that every man was judged
Yeah.
also, and so he can't break his word.
Right.
So then there has to be a judgment.
So would it be a one-on-one meeting, or do you think?
I have no idea. No idea. Asking for. That's funny you say that. That's our series this week, so that's interesting you said that. I don't know. It's going to take a while, yeah, but yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we'll hear. This is not clearly stated one way or the
I think
other.
there'll just be a sheet with all of it, or a book.
So just think about that as you're doing stuff. Oh, somebody, this is going to be told.
The judgment for a Christian could be on the white throne judgment that God says, I judge you as saved by Christ. You know,
Yeah, I don't know.
sinless.
And even Jesus talks about, them standing before the throne being judged and said, I prophesied in your name, I gave to
Yeah.
all these saints in your name, and Jesus said, I don't know you.
Right.
So it talks about that judgment and that your deeds will come
Yeah.
out, but the ultimate thing is how does Jesus respond to that?
Yeah.
But isn't it also true that when we ask forgiveness for our sins and we truly repent of our sins, that God wipes that sin away?
Yeah, I mean that.
So that's not gonna be there.
I don't know if that's what the verse is saying. The penalty for the sin is wiped away. I don't know that the sin is right. You're so. I think we can see it even legally in human terms, right? Like, I might ask for forgiveness for murdering, but I might still have the consequences of murder, right?
We're talking human there. I'm talking.
Well, God, there's okay. So a girl. Let's talk about okay. A girl sleeps with a guy, gets pregnant, is sorry that she slept with the guy that's not her husband. God forgives her of that, but she still has a baby. I mean, God's not going to wipe the baby away.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if
Sin away, that she's gonna make it hell.
Right, and the the spiritual consequences of those sins are taken away. But there's still physical consequences.
But on the other hand, if I murder somebody and then accept Christ, I'm not going to have to be judged for the murder that I've done because Christ takes the sin away.
Right.
And I don't go to hell because I murdered somebody.
Right. And so that's what I'm saying is that the penalty of the sin is taken away, but it's not that God forgets the sin.
You're still gonna go to prison.
Maybe.
Unless
Maybe.
President pardon.
So the penalty is gone, but it doesn't mean that the sin is not still there, or at least the consequences of that sin can still be there.
Lively discussion.
Yeah. Judgment, I guess. I mean, I guess that was more of a discussion than I thought. So we get to good stuff now. So hopefully we're through all the controversial stuff.